Hello, my name is John Glenn, and today I would like to discuss a paper written by Anna M. Mikulek and her associates about how toxic algae outbreaks can be defined as biological invaders. Here we will discuss the mechanisms that allow for harmful cyanobacteria to dominate an ecosystem and take a look at how these findings of the paper will affect the interactions humans have with their aquatic resources both locally and globally. On this slide, we're going to see a simplified example of something called the eutrophication process. The eutrophication process is what's going to allow these harmful cyanobacteria to take hold and dominate the aquatic ecosystem. The first thing we're going to see is farmers applying a layer of fertilizer to the soil to help grow their crops. When it rains, this excess nutrients added to the soil is going to run from the field into the water. Next, the fertilizer, which is going to be rich in nitrates and phosphates, is going to spark the overgrowth of algae into the bodies of water. When the algae begins to form, it's going to block the sunlight from entering the water and it's going to use up all the oxygen. Eventually, the water is going to become oxygen depleted. Finally, the water that is completely depleted of oxygen becomes a dead zone and can no longer support any life. This is evident every day where we live in northeast Kansas. I work for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers out at Perry Lake, just north of Topeka. We have the third largest ag lease program in the Kansas City district. As a consequence of this, we see significant nutrient runoff or loading into the waters that people in turn will recreate in, drink from, irrigate, and use in various ways every day. There are a couple of different ways these cyanobacteria can devastate their ecosystem. One way being releasing of toxins into their environment, which can cause dramatic fish kills. The other way that they can really disturb their environment is using up and depleting all the oxygen in their surrounding area. Blooms of cyanobacteria can become so thick that they block sunlight at the surface level of the lake. Without sunlight, photosynthesis stops, which means that there is no oxygen being released into the water. Dead bacteria sink and decay, which will in turn use up more oxygen in the process. Severe blooms, such as the recent 2011 outbreak in Lake Erie, which will be the topic of our discussion today, can completely deplete oxygen and cause very dramatic fish kills. We've discussed already on previous slides how large algae outbreaks can cause total oxygen depletion in the water. On this slide, I'd like to go over a couple of other potential complications from these outbreaks. Exposure to any algae outbreak can cause health effects in people and animals when water with blooms is either touched or swallowed, or even when the airborne droplets are inhaled. Exposure to high levels of this algae and their toxins can cause symptoms such as upset stomach, nausea or vomiting, skin, eye, throat irritation, and allergic reactions that could result in breathing difficulties. Eutrophication and these algae outbreaks account for almost one half of the impaired lake area and 60% of impaired river reaches within the United States alone. And algae-related water quality impairment can have very substantial negative economic effects. Even by the mid-1990s, there were 3,164 reported incidents of human poisoning and about 150 deaths in the Asian-Pacific region alone. Economic losses can exceed over $1 million US per severe event, and the monitoring efforts alone can cost up to $50,000 for the affected area. In coastal marine habitats, harmful algae blooms can render shellfish or finfish very toxic and cause massive fish and shrimp kills. Clearly, when we have these large outbreaks of cyanobacteria in our local ecosystems, we're going to see pretty severe side effects from either the toxins or the oxygen depletion. What we need to do is we need to start viewing these cyanobacteria as biological invaders instead of as a yearly blooming pest. the cyanobacteria is going to come in and is going to capitalize on its disturbed environment, the disturbance coming from the agricultural runoff into the lakes. Another defining characteristic of a biological invader that this cyanobacteria is going to have is it's going to devastate the other native organisms, from fish kills to stopping all photosynthesis from occurring in the water, effectively killing the other natural fauna there. And even though this cyanobacteria is not technically an invasive because it's also native to the area, we need a way to combat the severe outbreaks. And classifying this algae as a biological invader could lead to new studies on effective ways to treat lakes with harmful outbreaks. In 2011, Lake Erie experienced a record-setting harmful algae bloom. At its peak, it was over 3 times greater than any previous experienced bloom. What Anna Michalak and her associates are trying to determine are what factors led to this violent and sustained bloomage of cyanobacteria. For our discussion, we will use the data and methodology for tracking algae outbreaks to better understand the factors underlying the harmful bloomage in order to better combat the invasion in future events. What we see on this slide is a satellite image of Lake Erie taken on September 3rd, 2011. Overlaid around the lake using GIS are Lake Erie tributaries. The image shows the bloom 6 weeks after its initial outbreak, and even though it covers a majority of the western basin as seen in this image, the outbreak will continue to grow and spread for several more weeks after this image was taken until late October. What we see on this slide is a quick progression of the algae spread in Lake Erie. Image A was taken on June 1st of 2011. A series of massive rainstorms in late May led to high flow rates from the Maumee River, and in the image, you can see suspended blooms and nutrients from the river. Image B is from mid-July. In the far western basin, we can begin to see the microcystis, which is the algae, begin to bloom. This bloom took place after harsh winds resuspended the nutrients in the sediment along the western shoreline. Images C and D show gradual spread over the next several weeks until in image E, we see the initial bloom aided and spread by the Detroit River, which funnels into the center of Lake Erie from the northern Lake St. Clair. This leads to the final mature invasion in image F in mid-October, only to be subdued by a whitening event from Lake St. Clair via the Detroit River, in which calcium carbonate raises the pH of the water and begins to kill the algae. The author mentions whiting events as a way to decrease the amount of algae in the water. Just wanted to go over a little bit more what a whiting event is and why it's not a consistently reliable way of killing off the algae. A whiting event is a common occurrence in late summer and are caused by changes in water temp. This is going to allow for particles of calcium carbonate to form in the water column. Increased photosynthesis from algae and other marine life can reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the water column, and this is going to change the acidity of the water and allow the calcium carbonate to form. This increase in acidity is going to kill off the harmful phytoplankton in the water. So in a way, it helps solve the problem, but is really not a reliable way of, one, preventing the algae spread from occurring, and two, killing all the algae. What Anna and her team hypothesized was that a large contribution of the outbreak was due to rising demands from the land and farmers to produce more crops. Well, as we can see on the chart here, Nationally, corn cropland usage increased by 11%. This trend was seen in the western watershed of Lake Erie as well, and because corn calls for up to 36% more phosphorus in the fertilizer used than in other crops such as soybeans, we could expect to see a significant amount of phosphate loading from the land to the water. However, farmers have been using a standard for fertilizer deployment for years, so it is unlikely that land use alone was the cause of this algae invasion. In addition to agricultural trends leading to increased phosphorus loading into the soil, the autumn of the previous year before the outbreak was primed for preparing fields for harvest the following year, leading to maximum fertilizer application. That spring, a near record-setting amount of precipitation fell. The radar seen here displays a 2-day period over the Maumee River Basin, which feeds directly into the western basin of Lake Erie. During this time, over 2 inches of rain fell and washed a majority of the nutrients from the soil into the watershed. In May of this year, over 6.5 inches of rain fell, which is 75% over the 20-year monthly average. On this slide, we're going to see how the authors used a soil and water assessment tool model to test the impact of precipitation intensity and agricultural and nutrient management practices on the expected nutrient loading. This is going to determine whether the factors that were previously listed were likely to be responsible for the loading of nutrients observed in Lake Erie in 2011. The SWOT simulations indicated that the dissolved reactive phosphorus yields are sensitive to precipitation intensity, fertilizer application, and tillage practices, with the precipitation having the strongest influences and fertilizer timing having the least influence. This is going to support their hypothesis that the combination of both long-term trends in agricultural and nutrient management practices and the extreme weather precipitation events were the main contributors to the high yields of phosphorus that triggered the 2011 bloom in Lake Erie. In order to analyze how discharge and phosphorus loading into the river and then consequently to the lake influenced the spread of algae, the authors created this graph to better visually express their data. Again, we're going to see how massive rainstorms led to spikes in nutrient loading of the Maumee River and consequently to Lake Erie's western basin. Notice the spikes in the solid blue line indicating discharge spikes in the Maumee approximately 4 times larger than the dotted blue line that's going to represent the Sandusky that flows into the central basin. Uh, Also notice the amount of phosphorus indicated by the solid red line flowing into the lake just about halfway through the year, priming the lake for bloomage leading into the warmest summer months. This is going to create optimal conditions for cyanobacteria to grow and thrive in. The authors also hypothesized that temperature and wind conditions over the lake both before and during the bloom were going to encourage bloom growth, because warm and calm conditions before bloom onset would lead to minimal flushing of the lake system and encourage growth of microbacteria in the lake. However, as we can see on the graph here, the wind and surface temperature of the lake were about even or even below previous years. However, what we're going to see around day 200 is a massive wind resuspension event in which the water would kick up the sediment from the bottom of the lake, and we're going to see an increase of temperature between days 200 and 250 of about 3 degrees Celsius. This is going to occur just after the initial onset of the bloomage, which is going to lead to optimal growing conditions, eventually leading to the onslaught that Lake Erie experienced. Another aspect, along with weather and calm conditions in the lake, that the authors wanted to investigate was the role of circulation in encouraging the bloom. Simulations show that the Western Basin monthly circulation is characterized by a broad west to east flow that exits the basin in either a north, a middle, or a south channel, with relatively low current magnitudes correlating with increased residence times. All simulated years exhibited relatively low magnitude currents during summer months. What made 2011 a little more significant and different was that it had an extended period of weak currents from February to July. The residence time in the basin were during this period were between 46% and 36% longer than previous years. As you can see in figure B over here, we're going to see a more than 80% resident time of cyanobacteria in the western lowest current portion of the lake. Again, here we're just looking at the relatively low circulation from July through December in the western end of the basin, leading to increased resident time of the harmful cyanobacteria, and why it was able to hang around for so long, simply because there was no water movement for over 6 months out of the year during its prime blooming months. Simulations also show that long residence times were accompanied by a short-circuiting effect of the Detroit River waters, which is going to lead to a minimal mixing between the Detroit and Maumee River waters along the western and southern shoreline of the basin. This is going to diminish the dilution of nutrient-rich Maumee River waters. Although some mixing occurs near the islands between the western and central basin during the months of between April and August, the Detroit and Maumee waters primarily leave the western basin through the north and middle channels, respectively. As we can see in the figures here, the western and southern basins that are filled with the nutrient-rich Maumee River water are not being diluted by any clean water or any of the calcium carbonate whitening effects talked about earlier from the Detroit River. So, of the original hypothesized causes of the 2011 bloom, observations and simulations run by the authors confirm that long-term trends in agricultural practices are consistent with increasing phosphorus loads delivered into the western basin of the lake, and that weather conditions in the spring of 2011 led to record-breaking nutrient loads to the lake during the late spring. This conclusion is further supported by a much lower discharge in 2012, which led to a lower phosphorus loading and a weaker bloom that year. Lacking a policy intervention, many of the socio-economic forces driving the trends in agricultural and nutrient management practices found to have led to the 2011 bloom are likely to continue, increasing the likelihood of such massive blooms in the future. These harmful algae outbreaks don't just occur in faraway places. The damage done can be seen right here in your own backyards. Here are pictures from this year's algae outbreak at Perry Lake, and just like Lake Erie, Perry Lake is seeing a rising trend in fertilizer usage in warmer weather, with next to no turbidity in the water. Although Perry Lake's outbreaks never rose above a watch status, all indicators are pointing towards a massive algae infestation. Even the amount of algae seen here is enough to shift recreation regulations in the lake and alter irrigation usage of the local farmers. Clearly, we need a way to combat this problem, and the current fertilizer regulations simply will not do. Farmers need the fertilizer that they are going to apply to provide a source of income for their families as well as provide us with food. As far as our climate patterns go, we are already well on our way towards an ever increasing temperature and shifted weather conditions, wind patterns, etc. With recent successes in small scale invasive restoration, it seems plausible to me that treating algae outbreaks as biological invaders could be the next stepping stone in securing our freshwater ecosystems. To wrap up my discussion, it is clear from Anna Mikulak's research that large outbreaks of cyanobacteria in freshwater ecosystems are very likely due to increasing optimal conditions. It is my hope that future studies view these outbreaks as very serious, real threats to the natural ecosystem, and that viewing them as biological invaders will lead to breakthroughs in treatments. In the meantime, a bandage is desperately needed to slow the devastating effects of the algae outbreaks. To aid in this, we need to develop a national standard for fertilizer use and application that is reasonable and fair to all the farmers, and if possible, to develop a better understanding of the changing climate and its effect on priming our ecosystems for large algae outbreaks. This is going to be the end of my discussion. I just wanted to thank you all for your time and for lending me your ears and listening. And remember, if you're ever out on the water, don't forget to wear your life jackets. Always remember, a life jacket worn means nobody mourns. Please wear your life jackets. Have a great day.